Hey y'all, welcome to The Snake's Paw. I'm Andrew, and today on the show we are celebrating because Matthew has written a book. Matthew's novel, Her Changing Face, was just published, and it's available out there in hardback, paperback, ebook, and audiobook. So today we are celebrating by sharing the story behind the story. We're going to have a conversation, me, Jack, and Mafo, about where the story came from, some of the real life incidents that inspired it, and some of what y'all can expect if you decide to read Her Changing Face. So if y'all like what you hear, you'll be able to find Her Changing Face via some links that we're going to have in the episode notes. Look for that down below, and here we go.
Mafo, could you just give us like a short example of a few of the other amazing house parties that you threw, that you hosted, that you were proud of?
Oh, God. So for many years, I lived, and all three of us actually at some point lived at a house that we dubbed the Fofo.
Bless the Fofo.
Gained a sort of legendary aura about it. I lived there for 6 years. I lived there for the entire time that we lived there. You both lived there for 2 years, give or take.
Interestingly, even though I think each of us were roommates in pairs, I don't think at any point the three of us were all roommates at the same time.
No, that's never happened. And
too much awesome in one place.
Through many parties at that particular house, and because both I and our friend Merc, who plays Aileen in Starship Mudskipper, who also lived with us there, liked to host parties. They were almost invariably costume parties, or at least theme parties of some kind. Some of them were pretty straightforward, like the first, or one of the first, really, not the very first, but one of the first big parties we had there was an animal masquerade party. So it was like, animal, be an animal mask.
I remember that one.
And that party turned out to be huge. There were like over 100 people showed up over the course of the night, including people we didn't know. Our friend Tyler, who's also a friend of the show, has been on some of the basic pitches and has had some small roles. He was living with us at the time, and he was wandering around saying, "Whose party is this? This is a great party. Who's throwing this party?"
Because nobody knew him, so he just had to pretend to be a stranger. That was his costume.
And Merc's phone disappeared, and in its absence, he racked up, I think, over $2,000 or $3,000 on his phone bill on calls to Honduras.
Oh, no, I completely forgot.
Which I think
that.
he wriggled out of. He didn't have to pay them, but yeah. So that was a fairly straightforward theme, but a pretty massive party. Some of our parties got a little more esoteric. One of the best, I think, in terms of theme, for I think Merc's 28th birthday, he had a funeral theme party. So he threw his own funeral.
So good.
And so he made a paper mache like bust of himself and like a little cardboard coffin, and took a picture of himself like you would see at a professional like photographer studio, of him in like a bow tie holding our black cat Toulouse and grinning very, very awkwardly.
Often seen on the Instagram account. So maybe we should hunt down that picture and put it up on Instagram.
Yeah.
I think we kind of need to. You can't describe that and not do it. I would like to point out that paper mache body that Merc made of himself stayed at the Fofo for years, just like floating around. It's probably still there.
Until we moved out. Yeah.
Oh, souvenirs of everything. Well, and so
the ghost is definitely still there.
There are things that are still there, like this house. So when we first moved in, one of the residents was a friend of ours who is a bilingual native Spanish and English speaker. And Tyler decided that we all needed to learn Spanish while we were there. So he asked our friend to label a whole bunch of different objects in the house with their Spanish names on Post-its. And among those things that got labeled was the ceiling, el techo. So there was a Post-it on the ceiling that said el techo. And when the move out happened, which I was not a part of, I had moved out of the house by then. But when the big move out happened, understandably, the thing located on the ceiling was really easy to miss. And one of my pals got invited to a house party at that house and realized a little ways in that she was at a house that we had all once lived in and saw El Techo still up there on the ceiling, like 10 years later.
It's like, yeah. Oh my God. I love that so much.
Immortality comes in very weird forms.
Fingerprint.
One of the last parties I remember doing at that house, which was one I was really excited about and went all out for, it was, I don't remember the exact wording we used for it because it wasn't a Muppet party. And people who listen to our show regularly are going to think that I have an obsession with Muppets. I don't. It's just a big coincidence
Muppets are just great.
that all of my Muppet history comes together on this show. But it was a puppet themed party. But we did have a lot of people who came in costumes as Muppet characters. There were at least 3 Miss Piggies there.
Yes.
I spent a great deal of time and
Your
effort
costume
putting
was
together.
amazing.
Thank you. I still have it somewhere. As the red guy from Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. And as far as I can tell, that is the character's name, the red guy.
Yeah,
And I couldn't see anything all night because his face is covered in the little fur tentacles and his eyes are up top. And I just committed to it. And I just was blind for the whole party. And periodically I would peek out to see all the other awesome costumes. And I think, without giving away anything or too much, we might have to edit this one part out later. I don't know if this was inspiration for something that went into the book we're about to talk about or not. But I'm pretty sure there was a guy there all night who had this weird costume, like a giant eyeball on top of his head, and face was blacked out, didn't say a word the entire party, and we still don't know who he was. But he showed up and committed to that.
May have exerted an influence.
I mean, so while I'm sure there are lots more party stories and we can find time for them, there is no better segue right now that we could ask for to what we are all gathered here to talk about. So to leave things a notch mysterious for a second, Mafo, are you celebrating?
Yes.
How? What are
Tell
you
us
doing?
what
are
you're
you doing?
celebrating, Mafo.
I am celebrating the resolution of years of waiting to publish something.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Which I wrote.
It's a big deal. Yeah. And as we record, we're just a few days out. And as this is published, so as anybody is hearing this, it's already happened. So we say congratulations in advance. And anyone else out there can raise a glass to you because it is done. So are you doing anything to commemorate the occasion apart from hanging out with us?
Just getting it out there.
Good enough. Yeah. Where did this?
So yeah, it's something.
Go ahead.
It's something I wrote several years ago, and aside from some pretty cosmetic changes, have not really changed since I finished writing it. But it kept getting, it's kind of a matter of tried to find someone to do a cover and they weren't able, and then it got kind of pushed back and it kind of fell on the back burner. Then we started the Snake's Paw, and so it's something that kind of got pushed back just out of necessity, because I wanted like a good cover and I wanted to really do it justice, do things right, so to speak. And so I eventually found someone, a friend of mine, who did the cover about a year ago. And with her help and with the help of Jack, who was extremely helpful in the self-publishing process, I finally managed to assemble it into something that can be released in physical and digital and audio forms.
And for those listening to this in the Snake's Paw podcast feed, we are actually over on YouTube doing video on this one. So for those watching the video version, check it out. This is the cover.
I have not seen the physical copy yet. Thumb through it for me. Just go.
Yeah. Well, so Eden Chubb did this, who does book covers as well as a lot of other kinds of art. So we've got the front cover here and then the back cover, which portrays a costume party, not apropos of nothing. And then, God, just the sound.
Yeah, satisfying. I haven't even seen a physical copy either. I mean, I've seen pictures, but I am in Germany, so I couldn't have it sent to me.
And it is exactly 100 pages. So
nice and
it's
tight
very
and
like mathematically
concise.
Pleasing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a novella. Well, so we're going to have a whole other conversation about the self-publishing element, but that was part of what you decided to do. And it's kind of fascinating that like self-publishing was the reason. One, it's the reason why it's done at all. So props to you for going through the process, and to Jack for like illuminating the process. So we'll have a whole episode about that. But like having to do all the stuff related to self-publishing is also why it took as long as it did.
Yes.
And I'm curious because like when you're self-publishing, you're not done when you finish writing the thing, as the 4-year gap between writing and publishing makes pretty clear. 4 or so.
Yeah, that was probably
maybe
longer than normal.
Yeah, sure.
But yes.
I mean, I don't know if there is a normal post-production period.
Fair.
And I think that's something that we're going to really dig into in another conversation we're going to have specifically about self-publishing.
Behind the paw.
Well, and I'm curious, just having had to do all the promo stuff yourself, and for folks who are listening and who don't know anything about this story yet, how have you been pitching it? How have you been blurbing this story that, you know, obviously to you, you wouldn't write 100 pages if it didn't need 100 pages to tell the story, and yet you're stuck condensing it to an elevator pitch so much of the time. How do you go about doing that? What's your take on selling it to folks who don't know anything about it yet?
For me personally, writing the book was easier than describing the book, and I'm having to, and it's partly because the book is a little unusual in a few ways. It doesn't fit neatly into any particular genre, for one thing. So I can't just say, oh, this is a romance, although it has elements of what could be called romance to it. And I can't say, oh, this is like science fiction, because it's not science fiction, even though this is like a science fiction thing that takes place within the context of this otherwise realistic story.
Yeah. No, any of those would definitely set people up with misleading expectations.
Yeah. And so I've had to kind of... And then the structure of the story itself is kind of unusual. So having to describe that in some capacity without giving anything away, and doing that while also describing the story itself in some way is particularly challenging.
Yeah. You want to take a stab at it?
Yeah. Well, so actually, so we talked about Eden, who designed the cover. And I wanted to read. So when she was designing the cover, before I had done like a finalized blurb, she did a mock-up of the cover with a little like temporary blurb on it, which I'd like to read.
All right, let's hear it.
Because it was so good, and I liked it maybe more than my own blurb, and only didn't use it because it maybe didn't describe the story entirely. I'm going to read. So her version is, this is a book that involves a lot of bare asses and tits, but the sex scenes are not hot. They are meant to make you really fucking glad you're not in your 20s anymore. But also, as you sit alone in your house with your spouse watching TV, and all your friends do the same in their respective houses with their respective spouses because you were all so busy and tired, it does kind of make you sad that you don't all have parties like that anymore.
So from that, we get a few key things. One, that like parties, like what we were talking about earlier, are kind of at the heart of this thing, or big strong chunk of it anyway. And
there's some sex, and it's not sexy.
Yeah.
If I can make an observation about that. So first of all, I don't read a lot of romance. That's not a spoiler for most people who know me. And I don't know what romantic scenes really are supposed to look like. It's part of why I don't bother writing them. But I know that John Green has some famous if you call them sex scenes in one of his books that got him banned from libraries, and he was trying to describe it's mechanical and it's not sexy, and the fact that people think that it's sexy or sensual is appalling to me. When I was reading your book, I didn't know that the scenes weren't supposed to be sexy. Not saying that I found them sexy. I'm just saying I didn't know what to feel, so I went with the same open-mindedness that the characters in the scenes were probably having too.
I think that's a good approach.
So all that to say, I don't know if unsexy is necessarily the right description, or even not sexy. I think that they are sexy in their own right.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And I would invite anyone who is curious what I'm talking about to read it, and then maybe get in the comments and tell us, do you think that it was sexy?
I feel like Eden's description actually kind of does exactly what I feel about it. And I mean, I empathize with your position, Mafo, having to write it. I narrated the audiobook, so I also had to read all of these things, which was it's very detailed. It's very specific. And the language, there's no neutral language for sexual stuff. Every word is loaded with either clinical connotations, fuzzy, or really, really steamy connotations or euphemistic connotations. So that's really tough. And it's hard to know what tone to come at it with. I think what you finally struck, Eden's description comes at it pretty nice, which the opening sentence of the opening phrase of Eden's description, there's a lot of bare asses and tits. It doesn't cast judgment. It just says there's just a lot of bare asses and tits. And it's not necessarily celebrating the fact. It's just, that's what's in view. And in the same way, I look at the scenes that you wrote, and I'm like, these characters are having fun. They're into it. It does not mean that I am being invited to be part of a threesome in the way that I think a lot of erotica writing is kind of trying to do, to make you
for me,
a participant.
The sex scenes are just trying to approximate the reality of sex. In the sense that sometimes it's super hot, and then sometimes it's incredibly awkward, and sometimes it's somewhere in between, or it kind of fluctuates between those two poles. And
okay, so we're heavy on the sexual dimension of it, so which is a good thing for a prospective reader to know. But you emphasized as well, and I think Eden's blurb emphasizes that a lot of it is about kind of looking back on things. I don't know, how much of that do you feel like you like to tell people that doesn't give things away? Yeah, I think I'm not too I don't think of it as a spoiler thing. Yeah. It's just kind of the problem with that is it's too hard to go into detail about what it's doing in a blurb. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I think it's cool. If I wanted to tell people to read this book, I would be like, it's a really cool story in which you see somebody live a really visceral experience, the kind of thing that you will be reflecting on for years to come. And then you see them reflecting on it at different intervals, and the memory kind of looking different at each of those times. That's what I would do to get someone excited about it in 15 seconds. Gotten you to write my blurb. Turns out I'm much better at it verbally than I am in writing, though. In writing, it's a whole different beast. But that's the really cool thing that you've done. And I've joked about this book a number of times that the prelude, and I checked this because it's an even 100 pages. The math is easy. The prelude is 76% of the book. And then you have these reflections. The chapters are the retrospective moments of looking back at it. And they are subsequently shorter and shorter as the memory kind of condenses down over time. And it really drives home that memory, what you remember about something is totally about when you are remembering it and what's important to you then. And I think it does that really beautifully. So it grabs that kind of in your 20s, finding your way, living like a firework kind of feeling that was certainly true of our lives back when we were all roommates. And then the flavor of looking back on it with a mixture of longing and I think a notch of relief in the way that Eden described. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad it kind of comes across that way.
Yeah. That was so this is funny. This may set you up, Jack, for an observation that you made that I think definitely belongs in here. But when I recorded it, the thing that made the most sense to me was to record it, to do the short memories first, and then to do the full
kind of build up to it
take. Yeah. For whatever reason, that felt like the right way to come at it. And I think the way that you've encapsulated it, Jack, you made a really fun point about like, you could read it in a different order than it's bound.
Yeah.
I loved that. It never crossed my mind.
This is just my opinion. I love the book the way it's told, but I have observed that the story, you get a different version of the story if you were to read it back to front, if you were to start with the last chapter and then the next to last chapter. And it was an observation that I made right after I finished reading it, because I usually, whenever I finish digesting something, there's always those lingering, like, oh, what did I miss the first time around?
Yeah.
And this one specifically, I was like, well, if I were to try to go back and see with the new perspective, it would work out better to do it.
It has replay value.
The way that
sure.
you would probably, the way you would remember something, I think, like just what are the broad strokes, and then, well, I don't want to give away too much about the story.
Yeah.
So having gone through kind of the basic contours of it, Mafo, we haven't actually gotten to talk about this. Like, was there a sort of clear starting point to it, like a kind of grain of the inspiration?
Yeah. So, well, I had two ideas, and they're very conceptual ideas in my head that I wanted to explore. And one of them was kind of what you're talking about, like the way that memories change, or the way that we remember things, and how that affects how we perceive them, and how that changes over time, and how that could affect the telling of a story. So that was one idea. The other idea was a story that told the same story multiple times, but got shorter each time. And I kind of initially conceived it as like someone writing a rough draft of something, and then it getting shorter and more concise as it went on, which is still I think a worthwhile idea in its own right. But these ideas eventually kind of grew together, and then I kind of just took some very loose autobiographical elements, and both from my life, and I should say biographical things too, because there's just kind of things from the lives of people I know that have all kind of gotten thrown into it, and assembled this thing. And I actually kind of wanted, because I thought about, I could do, you could talk about, so for instance, there's the movie Rashomon. It's a Japanese movie from the 50s, which is about
Akira Kurosawa. Yeah.
It's like a court case.
It's like 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon. There's always like 6 degrees to an international movie from the middle of the 20th century in conversation with you. And we got there.
Yeah.
We got there.
It's, I don't know if this is just like in the air right now, Mafo, but I actually referenced that movie in the latest episode of Tales from the Road, which
wow.
I have not,
cool.
I have not done a full release on. So the fact that you brought it up just now, I'm like,
Wow.
And
weird.
So that one tells the story of like several different people remembering their version of an event in kind of like a court-like scenario.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I thought of, you could do something like that. There's a crime and this person remembers it in a certain way, and how they remember it changes over time. But I ultimately wanted to go with something that was very simple, because I wanted to focus on the memories themselves, not about any kind of moral weight these things might have, or
like
sort
solving
of
a mystery or anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I didn't want it to be too plot oriented, because I wanted to focus mostly on the experience and how the perception of the experience changes when you look back on it at different points in time.
I find it really interesting that you wanted to go with something that you said was simple, and you went with a relationship. Like, even
very
a
brief relationship
in this story was not simple by any means. But that's the way these stories tend to go. You have what you wanted to start with, and then they just sort of grow.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting too that you say that it's biographical or semi-biographical, because I think you and I both approach story writing in the same way, because people who know me well, if they read my books, they will see the elements that I picked out of my real life that I put into the fictional Jack in the gas station stories. Mm-hmm. And there's enough in there that you can say, like, somewhere between 10 and 100% of the story is completely true. It really happened. And I drew from my own experiences. And I think it's the same thing for Her Changing Face, to the point where when I was reading it, I could not get you out of my brain as the main protagonist. Like, I was seeing you in most of these most of these places where I was like, no, I'm supposed to, this is a fictional person that I'm imagining having sex right now. not my friend Maffo. I am not picturing him in coitus.
Goodness. Which,
thank you.
And
for
it's
that.
going to be, for the people who don't know, I have not listened to Andrew's audio book version of this yet. I'm looking forward to it, but I'm going to also have to try to remove Andrew from my brain when he gets to these points too. And I'm not going to be imagining
it is
you.
in the first person, so I'm talking like I did it all, and I'll say there's a lot of stuff in there that I have never done. So it took some imagination, or just rather, it took some lack of imagination. So I'm just barging through and saying the words.
Yeah. There have been a lot of people who have read, especially my earlier books when I first released them, who are like, "Oh, I know who this character is," and it's like, well, no, you might know some people who went into this character. Everyone is an amalgamation. It's like Sigmund Freud saying that you are everyone in your dreams, but it's like they're all pieces. They're all chimeras of memories and experiences
And all the stuff that you were pulling from real life, I think marries into the fiction beautifully, because you are picking things that have a character of, like, in the case of the party that happens, which is the whole big opening scene. And just to, like, pitch y'all on this a little bit, anybody, like, among the great first lines of literature, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, etc. The opening of this, I'm looking it up so I can get it word for word. Melissa is a banana wearing nylon stockings and stilettos. Like, done. I'm sold. I want to read the rest of this thing. But that whole opening scene is so, you feel like, and this, as you said, this is not a work of like sci-fi or fantasy, but you feel like you're in another world, and it meets with reality. It's a costume party, so it is reality in this transformed way, but it's got, who cares if the references are real or not? I know you made up a lot of what's in there, but you mixed real world whimsy and wonder with fictional whimsy and wonder, and all the pieces do what they're supposed to do. So I think it's really easy when you hear somebody like pulls autobiographical stuff into their writing. It's easy to imagine that becoming like self-indulgent, and that it really is about, it's the kind of songwriter who just, sings their journal, and that stuff can be really alienating and impenetrable. But I think, in this case, you've chosen those things really judiciously, such that I believe at least someone reading it won't necessarily be like, oh, this must be the real part, this must not, in the same way that I think, Jack, you pulled some of the most hallucinatory parts of your real life for the gas station books.
Thank you.
That's my one word blurb for gas station, hallucinatory.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And like I will say, like the party, it's worth noting the theme of the party in the book is a things that shouldn't turn you on party,
which is so perfect. Yeah. It's so on the
has
theme
so many
of the
possibilities.
Story. Yeah,
it makes me mad that I never actually threw this party.
It's not too late.
It feels like a party you would have thrown that I would not have gone to.
I mean, and you did do these.
There were a few that like I sat out, and you guys had invited me multiple times to. We can cut this out if you're embarrassed by it. I'm sure you're not. You guys invited me multiple times, and I'm not saying you guys as in Andrew and Maffo, mostly Maffo and Merc and some of the others, to an event, a traveling show in New Orleans called Big Dick's House of Big Boobs.
Yes, which I was actually going to bring up.
And the stories that you guys brought back from those events just like reinforce that I made the right decision not to go to, because it's not my scene, but my scene is definitely sitting on the couch, eating something, listening to you tell me these stories.
Hell yes.
Just like, I am glad I wasn't there for that. Ew.
Jeez, that
So
event.
So
Go
one of my
ahead, please.
favorite things was after Jack read the book Her Changing Face for the first time, he commented one of the things he was providing some feedback and offering some advice, because we do that for each other.
That's right.
And one of his comments was like, I've been to some of your parties, so I believe it, but I think it might strain credibility for like the average reader that this party might happen. Which I think is a sound. I
remember having that thought now.
And I think the place where it becomes credible, I think it's actually kind of wonderful if it starts off being incredible, is when you realize that most of the people attending that party are not going to their first costume party at this house. They're going to like their 10th costume party at this house. And you are looking at this like microculture of people who have raised the bar on each other and on themselves over and over and over again. Yeah. That's where it starts to feel like, I don't necessarily know these people, but I like maybe know people who know these people. Like I know these people for sure, but like for the average reader, that like I can believe those people exist, who that is how their group dynamic works.
And the party is kind of an amalgam of three things. One of it was inspired just by house parties that we threw and occasionally went to in New Orleans. And one of the other ones was Big Dick's House of Big Boobs, which Jack mentioned. And
I knew it.
So this was an event that was thrown by some people in New Orleans. It's actually by many names, but it started out as, and was kind of generally referred to as Big Dick's House of Big Boobs. And it was like an amateur.
Say that as many times as you can. Oh, it's so
it was like
stupid.
You say it 3 times.
So
It's like that appears in the mirror. Big Dick appears, and he's got big boobs.
Oh, no. So
and he's just jiggling everything.
Is like an amateur strip night where just whoever wanted to could go up on the like catwalk, and then like a stripper pole that they set up, and they could just do whatever they wanted to. And my God, they did whatever they wanted to. Jesus. Because the party that I depict in this book is very much a toned down version of what went on at this.
No, truly.
Each time they had this event, there were like new rules. Like this time you can't have raw meat on stage. And then one time
my
was like,
gosh, I think I remember the rule you're about to say.
One time they set the bar on fire because someone was doing a striptease to Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire, and they put down paint thinner and lit it on fire, and it got a little bit out of control. It all worked out in the end, but the bar didn't want them having it there anymore, so they had to relocate. I also saw some truly disgusting things.
Was this the story? Was this the time that you casually went to a bartender and was like, hey, the bar's on fire, and the bartender said, shut the fuck up at you?
Yeah, it's like, no, really, the bar's on fire. And she's like, shit.
I had that version of that memory in my brain, but I didn't connect it to Big Dick's House of Big Boobs.
Same night.
A lot of weird stuff happens to you that I'm not privy to in first person.
I don't think I knew about the fire, about you like notifying them of the fire, or the fire being the reason why they moved. Because the last time I went, it was in like a very unsafe warehouse where you would be like, "Oh, no one's going to tell you what you're not allowed to do here." It was like the unsexiest possible venue. 100%, except like industrial, like the murder factory, covered in rust, like way after the murders were done with. So it had definitely, I don't know, I think it had gotten so transgressive at a certain point that it had sort of like made its point and was done. It was a little bit like classic, the first and second seasons of that show were pretty good, but the stakes creep got a bit much later on.
Yeah.
I lost the plot a few iterations in, but God, was it fascinating for the first little bit, just as like a thought experiment.
It was a lot of
how
fun.
crazy.
I had a great time.
What can you get people to do in public? Yeah, it was fascinating.
So that was kind of an influence. And in particular, there's like a catwalk scene during the party. They have like a mini event during that party, which is something we do at our parties. Like during Merc's funeral party that he had for his birthday, we had people told eulogies, or has like said eulogies for him, including, and this is my favorite part, there are these two guys who were like lived on the same block as us and just saw that we were having a party and came in with rum and was like, hey, do you mind if we hang out? And we were like, yeah, sure. And this guy who had never met Merc before, like an hour earlier that night, gave a eulogy for his paper mache carcass. So you just have like wonderful things like that happen. And so there are like elements of that end up in the story. And the third thing that influenced the party in kind of a smaller way was that we had a book when we lived at the Fofo that just kind of lived in the kitchen and people just flipped through it when they were over, called Things You Should Not Masturbate To. And it's just a book of just kind of random. Some of them were sort of things that looked like a tree, that looked like genitalia or something. One, like the cover was just an old man chopping ice,
a naked old man in the ocean with an axe. Yeah. And so I think that, and I don't even think that was a conscious influence. It was like after the fact, it was like, oh, that probably influenced kind of the concept behind this theme party. So yeah, like about almost a quarter of the book is just this extended party scene where Nick, the main character, is one of the hosts, one of the three people who lives in this house, is just kind of going around hosting the party, kind of trying to orchestrate things, make sure things kind of, goes smoothly, and then ends up meeting this person during the party and hits it off with her. And then, it's so delightful to narrate because it's so sort of matter of fact about like, oh, here's this costume, this is what's happening on the catwalk right now. It's this almost like journalistic way of describing this scene of chaos. And so you just see, like, when I picture the character moving through it all, it's just, he's very impassive with just a little bit of a smile on his face of like, yeah, I made this happen. So I don't know if that comes through for other people, but that's very much how it felt for me in reading it.
Yeah. And then most of the rest of the Prelude, which is the opening section, which, as you mentioned, takes up like 3/4 of the book almost. The rest of it is kind of this fling or love affair that proceeds. And then you have 4 shorter sections after that, which are each at different points further and further in the future, with the main character Nick looking back on the party and this fling with this girl that he met there and sort of all that, and also to some extent things that have happened since then kind of leak in as well.
Yeah, and the rest of it continues to have these sort of like magical touches, either in the nature of the activities that they do or just these the way that the story is told. Moments kind of go out of focus. He goes very internal sometimes. I mean, it's for anybody who's mostly heard your stuff on The Snake's Paw, it's going to be different, but I think there's a playfulness with the how about you that even if you're not doing sci-fi or something like that, you are still always kind of like messing with the shape of a story. And I feel like people who have enjoyed what you've done here are still going to feel pretty at home with what you're doing over there. The through line feels very clear to me.
Hopefully, and that's,
it still has your voice to it, though, and that's something that we discussed this before we even started recording about how maybe we should let people know that this is not the sort of thing that you would see on our podcast, and like, it's not. We don't really do this shape of story.
Yeah, and we try to stick to genre.
There is definitely a voice to it that carries through, and people who are familiar with your voice will see it in this. And if they like that, I don't think that anyone's going to read this and be upset.
Hopefully.
Necessarily.
Be upset.
That is what I strive for. Anyone who reads my book, I just want them to not be upset. That's all.
And I think that's one of the things I wanted to bring up is that it is a bit different from Snake's Paw stuff. There is, like, it kind of plays around, it, like, flirts with sci-fi. There's a scene where they visit, like, a sci-fi film set. And the fact that it has a somewhat unusual structure, like saying, hey, I'm telling the story, like the same story 5 times in this book, is a little bit of a hard sell, arguably. Even if it's told in 5 different ways. If you just say that,
and if you don't know the person who's doing it to you, like if someone were to just be like, this author tells the same story over and over, I'd be like, well, why do I need to hear it more than once? But like knowing you and knowing the way that you tell stories, like I didn't even have like a second thought. I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. I want to see how he does it, because it's going to not be what I'm expecting. And that is, I was not disappointed to see that was true when I read it.
Yeah. And like, there are people who, and like, I've had to give myself this feedback on ideas in retrospect, where like, if what you have as a starting impulse is a sort of, ooh, it'd be fun to distort the classic story shape in this way. It'd be fun to put this like, you know, kaleidoscope lens onto it. Sometimes if you do that stuff, you don't manage to actually do the just straight up simple story that's at the heart of it. Like you miss the basic thing in the name of you know, you do the triple axel and then you fall on your face. And I think one of the things I really love about this is I think the Prelude stands on its own. It's a really compelling story to begin with, albeit a very like real world story that is high stakes only for the person who it's happening to. It's like, it's got emotional stakes. You know, on the podcast we do like, oh, in Starship Mudskipper, the stakes are 20% of the universe is going to be destroyed by someone pressing a button. Like, it's ridiculous high stakes. And the stakes here are very personal. They're very emotional. So it's into kind of downright normal writing in that way. But it's a really compelling story. And then when you get to the end of it and then you play with it several other ways, it adds something to that. But the base is enough on its own. Like, that's one of the reasons why I'm really proud of you for this.
Oh, thank you.
I think that you just said what I really wanted to say this whole time, Mafo, that I'm just really proud of you for writing this, for getting it, for achieving it. And I know that like the post-production part of this has been a learning experience and a nightmare. I know, because I've been there before, and it's tedious and annoying. And you should be proud of getting that out of the way as well. But really, like, I'm proud of both of you guys for everything that you all have produced. But this is a big achievement, Mafo, and I wouldn't say that to anyone who has written a novella. Nope, I take that back. Let's just cut that whole statement out, because anyone who writes a novella, that is an achievement. But what I wanted to say was yours is more than just you wrote a thing. You wrote something that's really impressive.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll take your word for it.
Well, and other people don't have to take our word for it. So do you want to do the rundown of how people can find it if they want to find it?
Yes. So we'll have, if you're watching this on YouTube, we'll have all this stuff in the description. If you're on the podcast, we'll put it in the episode description. Links to the different versions of this. So it's going to be in 4 different versions. There's going to be a hardback, or like a hardcover, a paperback, an ebook, and an audiobook on Audible, which was recorded by Andrew. And so you'll have that Snake's Paw touch to it as well, hearing his narration, which is always a joy, just hearing his voice. And he did a great job. I'm really, really pleased with my collaborators in this effort. Jack helping with a lot of the technical stuff and the publishing elements. Andrew helping with doing the narration. And then Eden, who did the cover, just put in great work. I also had my friend Sam, who helped me with some of the formatting the kind of the design of the text on the interior.
Yeah, easy stuff to overlook, but it makes a big difference in the enjoyment of the experience. So those of you who get the physical book or the ebook, you are seeing Sam's work too. Yeah, so we'll have all of that stuff in the various descriptions. And Mafo, congrats again.
Thanks. Is there anything else we should touch on?
If people want to kind of hear a little bit of a behind the scenes for the process that you and I both went through in producing a book, we are going to have another episode about that, which we will either, if it's already been recorded, we will link to right now. And if not, then stay tuned.
For anybody who does want to try out or is just thinking about self-publishing and like wants to know what does that choice represent? What am I committing to once I do it? Like, Jack has a ton of experience there. Mafo now has a real strong first bite of experience, and I will be on this conversation as well. And I am completely ignorant about it. So we'll have every level of experience represented.
Yeah. And stay tuned for an excerpt from Her Changing Face. Just a small section of the audiobook for y'all to listen to, as much as Audible will let us give you. And if you want to listen to more, I'd be happy to have you buy my stuff and give me money.
That is the ulterior motive all along. You're finally going to be a zillionaire after this.
Oh yeah, just counting the minutes until all the money starts rolling in. All those millions.
Oh, Mafo, I have some terrible news for you. One of the pieces of advice they say for new writers is don't do it for the money. So.
Yeah, that's very, very true. I mean, I can say as someone who's been working on The Snake's Paw for several years now, it's not a profitable venture.
Well, thank goodness child rearing is super affordable.
Oh, yeah. Hey, y'all. Matthew here. Just one last note before I let you go. We'd like to share an excerpt of the audiobook of Her Changing Face with y'all, narrated by Andrew. Unfortunately, Audible has not yet approved the audiobook, so we have to wait for that to go through. That will take at least a few more days. Until then, the paperback, the hardcover, ebook, those are all available. You can find links in the description below. We'll add an audiobook link once it's available. And when the audiobook becomes available, we will share the excerpt as a separate episode. So look forward to that. Also, keep an eye out for the Behind the Paw episode that we mentioned earlier about self-publication and the trials and tribulations thereof. That should come out in the next week or two. See you then.